of boundary issues. This is where we're going to get a little bit deep. So the root of our boundary issues, the root of what it is that we are struggling with individually, all comes down to our story. Now, what do I mean when I'm talking about our story? I mentioned last week in one of our actionable steps, the Psalm actionable step, that was from Adam Young Counseling. Adam Young is who I learned, I feel like, the most about this idea, this concept of our story. He has a podcast called The Place We Find Ourselves. It's really great. Highly recommend it. But it talks about, it's all rooted around this idea of our story. And our story is basically what we gained through our childhood. Now, when we think about stories, we think about how our life is, like our life as a whole, beginning to end. It's really an epic story. It's spanned over decades. And we have characters. We have major characters and minor characters. We have settings. Where you were born was a setting. Your first grade classroom is a setting. All these settings. We have plots, the big foundational plots of our lives. We also have subplots, the subplot that happened this one time, like over here on the side, and themes that come throughout our experience. We have these plot lines with our mother. We have a plot line with our father, our siblings, and all of these things, all of these aspects of our story, they really shape the trajectory of our lives and our relationships. They're very, very powerful. Now, why does this matter? Well, the truth is that your brain, during your first few years of life, really years 0 through 5, but I'd put an emphasis on those first 2 to 3 years, but really 0 through 5. Those first years, your brain is taking in the absolute most that it ever will. It is a computer working overtime. You would not believe what these brains are doing. It's absolutely insane. So the events and the ways that you were cared for from womb to 2 to 5 are actually the events that impact you the most, despite you really not explicitly remembering them or remembering most of them. So recognizing that those events become our filter for everything else. It's a protective mechanism. So then the question becomes, during that period of time, how are you treated and cared for? Were your caregivers maintaining attachment with you? Were they responding quickly to your needs? And then what was going on in the plot lines of their own lives that was impacting them, that was thus impacting you when you really didn't have much of a say? What kind of boundary situations were there between themselves and the others close to you that you were, experiencing, watching, soaking in, and that were influencing you, just by proxy? Now, all of these events, let me make sure I'm not, okay. All of these events created really a filtering system. So this big filtering system through which you saw and still see the world. So it's your schema. It's the way that we process every single event that happens to us is through this filter that was created when we were 0 to 5 years old. There's research that shows that nobody sees any event with complete objectivity. We can't. Nobody experiences life objectively. We can't. We literally cannot do that because our brains, so smart, for the sake of protection, filter everything through previous experiences. And those first being the entire foundation, the entire scaffolding. So when we have this filter, it's kind of like our rose-colored glasses, whatever colored glasses they are, they're a filter. So we're wearing these all the time without even knowing that we're wearing them. And whatever made up that filter, any events that we experience, we're going to experience them through that filter. So if that filter is not like the most productive filter, maybe it was a little bit scary, maybe it was a little unattached. Whatever it is, the events of our lives that we're experiencing, they're going to be seen through that filter. It will be easier for us to pick out certain events as, scary or threatening or feelings of abandonment if that's what we experienced as a child, because that's the filter that we're seeing things through. So if we grew up in a family who didn't recognize the importance of attachment, which we know and will talk about is so important, and attachment comes before boundaries. So with our newborn babies, like boundaries don't exist. We're one being. So if our family of origin didn't understand that and they weren't very attached, that's going to impact the way that we see things. Or if we didn't have a family who knew how to set boundaries in their own lives and thus didn't know how to do so with us, even from the very beginning, that is going to impact us. So that may, depending on like what we experienced, that may feel really good. And you may feel like, whoo, thank goodness. Like I had it really good. My parents were attached with me. We're golden. You may feel like, oh crap, like this is not good. I didn't have the chance to build a solid filter. Like, what do I do? There is such good news. It's beautiful news, and that's that we can heal. One of the simplest ways for us to do this is actually through sharing our story, sharing parts of our story, sharing a story within the story with a loving and empathetic group of people. Why? So when you share your story, and this is very important, with someone who is actually willing to deeply listen and hold space, like that's a very important, critical component. I'm not saying like when you share your traumatic story with the random pregnant lady in the grocery store, like that's not the time. But if you're sharing with an empathetic listener, this is set up for you to do this and share this story. Then they're deeply listening and holding space. You actually have the opportunity to change neural pathways in your brain to begin the healing process. Like what? That is, our brains were designed so that we can, in the future, heal ourselves. Like what a divine design. You did not have control over that, the way that filter, the way that scaffolding, the way that structure was put together. You didn't have control over that. You were a baby. But you do have control now to heal your brain. And healing comes in two big categorical ways. So when we experience something that is traumatic, what happens is our left and right hemispheres get disconnected. So they're not talking to each other. And so then also our front and back, our prefrontal cortex and our limbic system, our limbic brain, they also can get disconnected. So that's when we experience those traumatic events, that happens. And then what happens with, especially like, so I guess to try to explain what it means is that our thoughts about the event and our feelings about the event become disconnected. So everything's just kind of swirling around. It doesn't necessarily make sense. And sometimes we'll feel those emotions in our body. We'll feel that as trauma. And so at the same time, when we've experienced a stressful event, the cortical thinking brain and the limbic survival brain, when we are able to share that story after that traumatic event has happened, we're able to reconnect those. So we're connecting left and right, we're connecting front and back. And this will typically happen when we're able to share something that brings a sense of the fight or flight state. Like I said, the trauma feelings, the feelings inside of our body, the physical feelings. But what's so cool is that when we share the story, when we have that fight or flight sensation, when there's someone else there that's listening to you, who is an empathetic, deep listener, compassionate listener, their nervous system actually is able to connect with and communicate with our nervous system to help us regulate. That's insane. That's the most amazing thing ever. We're going to be talking more about the nervous system because it's my favorite thing in the world. But just hear that and understand how amazing it is. Our nervous systems can communicate with one another and calm each other down. So when you're telling your story with someone and you're able to share with an empathetic, calm listener, they are going to help your body calm down, and they're helping those connections front to back and side to side take place. That provides integration and it heals the neural pathways. So healing from our stories provides us with an ability to be more empathetic. It allows us to act from a place of deep understanding. When we understand the ways that we were sinned against, sometimes very intentionally sinned against, sometimes more passively, more unknowingly, we're able to reflect and consider how we're going to choose to function as parents. Now, I think it's really important for us to recognize something. A lot of people feel like, I don't want to do that. Like, my parents, okay, they made some mistakes. Like, fine, I recognize they made mistakes, but I love them and everything's okay. And it feels like you don't want to go into like a victimhood mentality, which is totally fair. But I think here's what's really, really important. You saying something that happened is not the same thing as saying you are bad parents for what you did. No, it's acknowledging your parents are human parents, just like me and you. Of course, they didn't do everything right. That's why we're sinners in need of a savior, right? Like, yeah, they messed up. So do I on a daily basis. So acknowledging like, this is what happened to me and this is what hurt me and this is how it hurt me. Stating those things is not the same thing as casting blame. It's not the same thing as saying like, oh, you're terrible because you did this. No, it's just acknowledging what happened. It's much better than sweeping it under the rug. It really, really is. And it helps us understand, like it gives us the ability to give ourselves grace too, because we are going to make mistakes. We are, no matter how much, no matter the fact that if I could, I would not, like I would choose not to hurt my children and harm my children in any way. But I do, because I am a human and we can do all the work in the world. And by golly, we're still going to be humans. So remembering that as we're going through this is not, and maybe you have an actual rightful reason to be furious with your parents. Like, I know there are some stories where you absolutely do, but maybe you don't, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that your story is invalid now. There still were things that happened and they still impacted our lives, and that's okay to acknowledge. It's important, in fact, to acknowledge. So, like I said, it allows us this ability to be more empathetic. It allows us to act from a place of deep understanding, and it just helps us integrate everything that we've experienced. It allows us to make better choices in the future because we have integrated these things. It's going to help us consider how we are going to choose to function as parents generally. Once again, we are going to be human parents, so there's going to be some deviations. But one thing that I think is important for us to understand is why healing our boundaries is important for birth, but even more important for parenthood, is that our desire is to break these generational curses, right? Like, there's so much sin and sadness that's caused from these mismanaged boundaries. So if our goal is to break that, we kind of need to be able to peel back the layers and see what they actually are and see how they evolve or how they presented in our own lives. So yes, healing our boundaries is going to be important for birth, and it's going to be even more important for parenthood, like I just said.